Hello everyone and welcome to Therapists Connect broadcasts. So we're here today for what is our third debate on scoped framework. And I think it's probably fair to say that this is hopefully going to be the biggest one, just due to the fact that we've got a variety of different people here giving different opinions. And we're really actually quite excited about this because we hope that for any of our watchers, this is going to really engage you with this project. You're going to be able to hear lots of different thoughts and maybe actually be able to form an opinion about how you feel about the scoped framework. So Peter's going to say a bit more on the makeup of the panel in a bit, but I just want to say that I'm really happy that we've got some of the people here today who have been involved in the framework, representing some of the membership bodies, which is actually going to enable us to ask some questions today that we haven't been able to ask previously. So welcome everybody. For anyone who doesn't know me, my name is Caz Binstead, and I co-run Therapists Connect with my my friend and esteemed colleague, Dr. Peter Blundell. So over to you, Peter.
Thanks, Caz. Yeah, thank you from me for all the panelists today. I really appreciate your time coming here. So for those who don't know about Therapists Connect, we are an open community of therapists from across the world. And basically our main aim is to kind of bring discussions and debates together around therapy and the therapy community. If anyone's interested in finding out, then go to our website and the details are kind of running across the screen right now. My name's Peter Blundell and I'm a senior lecturer at Liverpool John Moores University, and I teach on the master's programme there in person-centred and experiential counselling and psychotherapy. As people might know, I have been a critic of the SCoPEd project. I recently signed the open letter from the person-centred community asking for the project to be put on hold. But I am also acutely aware that there are many different views on SCoPEd, and I think it's important for all those views to be heard, so we can fully consider the impact of this project and what it might, the impact it might have on our profession. So, as per the previous debates that we've held, I see my role, along with Caz, as facilitators to enable this discussion to happen. And I think really it's really important that we are having this discussion and getting able to hear lots of different views on this project. Caz, do you want to talk about a little bit about some of your declarations?
Yeah, I've only actually got kind of a couple to make. One is that I do have an affiliation with one of the membership bodies, which is the BACP. So I sit on the Private Practice Divisional Executive Committee there as a specialist in the area. But I am obviously here today in my guise as Therapists Connect facilitator, and we obviously have a representative from the BACP who will be talking about the organisation's role in SCoPEd. So that's the first thing. And the only other thing is that some of my views on SCoPEd have also been known and have been in the public domain. So in 2019, I wrote a critical analysis paper on the project where, for various reasons, I didn't believe that it was the right framework at that time. But like Peter, I really, really strongly believe in us talking in our profession. I think it's so important. You know, actually, I just hope today we can just get kind of, you know, really in there and have a great discussion. So yeah, now Peter has disappeared, which is interesting. If he comes back in a moment, we're going to talk a little bit. He's going to give a little bit of an overview of the SCoPEd project. But maybe, oh, I think he's coming back. Let's just give him a second. Okay, well, while we're, you're back. Can you hear me, Peter?
Can you hear me okay?
Yeah. Can you hear me, Peter?
Yeah, I think it's something to do with my internet connection, I think, but hopefully I'm back now if everyone can hear me okay.
Good stuff. All right. Well, I was just going to pass over to you so you can just give a bit of an overview of the SCoPEd project. Okay, not sure he can hear me. What I'm going to do instead is we're just going to press on, and I'm actually going to introduce everybody that we've got here today. So I'm going to start with introducing Ashleigh Dunford-Bishop. So maybe just wave or something when I introduce you, by the way. So Ashleigh is a registered integrative counsellor and is working in private practice. And she has focused her private practice on working with young professionals struggling with anxiety and supporting people affected by cancer. Having previously worked as a counsellor for a local cancer charity and continuing within private practice, she is passionate about improving access for cancer patients to counselling services that are considerate of their unique own needs. Okay, and next we've got Meg Nunn. Okay, so Meg is the CEO for the National Counselling Society, also known as the NCS. So Meg has worked for the NCS for almost 6 years in a variety of roles. She believes her responsibility now is to listen to and collaborate with members in order to provide the best possible support and service for them, and to lead her team members at the Society to do the same, no matter what their role. The NCS has recently joined the Technical Group and SCoPEd Oversight Committee to collaborate with all of the partnering organisations to help shape the project, representing the voice of their members, and add their own perspective, knowledge and expertise to the discussion. And next we have Ian Parker. So Ian is here as a representative of the PCP group, and he's a practicing psychoanalyst in Manchester. So Ian trained with the Centre for Freudian Analysis and Research, and he is Honorary Secretary of the College of Psychoanalysts UK. His books include Psychoanalysis, Clinic and Context, Subjectivity, History and Autobiography, Routledge 2019. And today he is here speaking as a panellist for the representatives of Partners for Counselling and Psychotherapy, PCP. And the PCP are a group of 14 organisations with a shared purpose to protect counselling and psychotherapy from restrictive standardisation and homogenisation, supporting a wide range of good practice in the field. So then we have Fiona Ballantyne-Dykles. So Fiona is the Chief Professional Standards Officer and Deputy CEO at the BACP, the British Association of Counselling and Psychotherapy, and previously Head of Professional Standards. So prior to joining the BACP executive, she served as a trustee and deputy chair of the BACP Board of Governors, while in post as Head of Qualifications of Counselling and Psychotherapy Central Awarding Body, the CPCAB. Fiona is a senior accredited member of the BACP and still has a small practice as a counsellor, supervisor and member of a service offering counselling in the Wiltshire area. Previous professional roles include trainer and programme leader for counselling training at a large further education college and chair of the Federation of Awarding Bodies. Fiona has a special interest in counselling training and assessment and a long-held passion for supporting the vocational route into the counselling profession. She is currently chair of the SCoPEd Technical Group and has been involved in the project since 2017. So Sam Driscoll. So Sam is a person-centred therapist with a private practice in Eastbourne, East Sussex. And he is somebody who believes in the evolutionary qualities inherent within person-centred philosophy and is therefore resistant to the constraints and misunderstandings that are imposed upon person-centred therapy and its practitioners, as they deny and distort, he believes, the person-centred approach's true potential. And he was recently a signatory on the new open letter from the person-centred community asking BACP to help to halt SCoPEd and open and inclusive dialogue. And this was signed by 21 organisations and 400 plus academics, therapists and trainers. So Dr. Jan McGregor Hepburn. So with a background in social work management and psychoanalytic psychotherapy, Jan has, as well as presenting papers at conferences, Jan has devised and facilitated both seminars and workshops on a variety of subjects related to both management dynamics and clinical topics. She is author of a book chapter and journal articles, and is the registrant of the British Psychoanalytic Council, the BPC, and a trainer for the North of England Association for Training in Psychoanalytic Psychotherapy. Jan has been registrar of the BPC since 2005 and chairs the Professional Standards Committee. Jan is on the reading panel of the British Journal of Psychotherapy and has a doctorate in psychoanalytic psychotherapy from the University of Northumbria. She is BPC's representative on the SCoPEd technical group and has been involved in the project from the beginning. And then finally, we have Faisal Mahmood. So Faisal is a UKCP registered individual and group Gestalt psychotherapist, a BACP accredited counsellor and a UKCP approved clinical supervisor. So Faisal currently works as a senior lecturer in counselling psychotherapy at Birmingham's Newman University, heading up the MSc and the Advanced Diploma programmes in counselling and psychotherapy, UKCP accredited for postgraduates. So welcome everybody. Just give me 1 second. I need to check my phone to see what's going on with Peter. He hasn't actually messaged me. Let me just message him.
There's something in the private chat, Caz.
Ah, right. Okay, let me...
You're just saying he can't, he's having problems with his connectivity.
Okay, so we'll see if he comes along. Until he does, let me just see if I can just tell people a little bit about the SCoPEd project itself. So SCoPEd stands for the Scope of Practice and Education, and the BACP states that the project aims to agree an evidence-based framework to inform the training requirements, competencies and practice standards for counsellors and psychotherapists who are working with adults. The project has been, up until now, a collaboration between the BACP, the UKCP and the BPC, although, of course, now some of the other PSA membership bodies are entering into talks and collaboration, which is including the NCS, which we've got representative for today. So on the 14th of July 2020, the second iteration of the SCoPEd project was released. And the project states that this new version of the framework has taken into account the response from the members and stakeholder consultation in 2019, although this still remains in draft format. So as Therapists Connect, we are really happy to obviously have the three organisations here. We have reached out in the past in our debates because we felt it would be good to have people involved in the project kind of answering questions. So as I said earlier, we're really happy that that you guys are here today. I'm just going to check in with Peter. Peter, can you hear me?
Hi, Caz. Yeah, I can.
Oh.
I've had some issues with my internet connection just typically today. So what I'm doing is I'm accessing this from my phone broadcast instead.
Good stuff, good stuff. Okay, so just to fill you in, Peter, I've just given a little bit of an overview of the SCoPEd project, and I've also actually introduced everybody already. So do you want to just talk a little bit about the makeup of the panel and putting together this panel?
Yeah, absolutely. So we've tried to get a very balanced panel today. However, we have had limited space, and obviously we've got limited time today around what we can do on this panel. So we've had, because we've got quite a lot of organisations on the panel, we thought it was really important that we had individual therapists who aren't representing any kind of organisation here today. So we've tried to have a balance of kind of organisational views as well as individual therapists as well. We had the potential to have panellists on here from Counsellors Together UK. We've also had the opportunity for clinical commissioners for the NHS to come on board this panel. But we tried to make a decision on who was best placed, and we couldn't fit everybody on. So obviously we've decided on the current panel members today. We will try and get those other people onto the panel for further discussion for future debates. And some of those people who couldn't come on the panel today have submitted questions and quotes to kind of ask the panel and to add to the discussion, so that we have included them in some way. So I think that's it really, Caz, in terms of the panel. I presume you've done a bit of an introduction around the SCoPEd project itself.
Yes, I have. Yes. So what I'll do is I'll just give a little bit of an overview of what's going to happen today. So for anyone who's watched our previous debates, this one's going to be a little bit different in that we have chosen certain themes, and we're going to be asking questions from those themes. And probably maybe a couple of people we're going to direct questions to, and then we're going to be inviting people to just jump in and just kind of organically chat with each other. So Peter and I will pause once we've asked someone and someone's answered. We'll pause before we jump in to see if anyone else wants to come in, and obviously if more than one person comes in, we'll kind of facilitate that. So hopefully we can get a bit of debating going. So in our role as facilitators, we are obviously here to just make everything as clear as we can and to hold the space. We will come back to you on things if we don't understand. So if we think we've heard something and we're struggling to maybe understand the answer, we may just think, okay, well, perhaps viewers might feel the same. So we may just ask you to say a little bit more on that. So coming onto the space itself, we really want this space to be a safe and respectful space. So we're not afraid of emotion here. You know, we're all here, you know, with different views that I'm sure people feel passionately about. So it's absolutely fine to express it in the way that you express it, but please just do so in a respectful way that sees the other person and also allows the other person's views to be properly heard. Yeah, let's just probably keep it on policy. So let's just keep it on the framework. Let's not make anything personal. But there may be reasons that you might want to say, look, this is important that I ask this of this particular membership body, for example. So we just ask that if you're doing that, you just explain a little bit about the reason why you're directing that question that way. So yeah, I think that's probably everything. Does that cover everything? Does that sound okay, everyone? Good stuff. All right, so Peter, on to the first question.
Okay, thanks very much. I appreciate that you had to do all of that introduction. So our first question, we're going to launch straight into kind of some of the deeper questions here. Many therapists have raised issues with the SCoPEd project because they say it represents a hierarchy, so a tiered system within which therapists are ranked according to their relative status or authority within the profession. So
Okay, so it sounds like we've lost him again. But what the question that he's asking is, you probably heard some of that, that people feel that this represents a hierarchy. So what are panelists' thoughts about whether SCoPEd in its current form does indeed represent a hierarchy or not? And we're going to start with Jan on this one.
Okay. Well, I guess it depends what you mean by hierarchy. I don't think it's ever been about who has more authority. It's just describing what is and the amount of training that they do and the things we expect them to be able to do at the end of it. I think the trouble with to my mind, the trouble with the word hierarchy is it implies some things are better than others. And I don't think that's ever what we've thought or ever how we've practiced. We, certainly from the original stakeholders and now the people joining us from the PSA, everybody that is qualified and registered is a highly qualified professional. So there isn't really a question of, somebody is somehow not good enough. That's why I don't like the word hierarchy, but certainly as we have worked through it, there are different competencies and more training, the more specialist somebody might want to become. But all of our registrants are of high value and well trained. I mean, that's one of the delights. That's what we thought. That's one of the delights that's come out of it for me.
So my response to that is a sense of where it's not better and there's not less. Yeah, we've got column A, column B, column C. And column C can do everything column B can and everything column A can, plus a little bit more. Now, that's why it's a hierarchy, because it's saying these people are better, these people are mid, and these people are still good, but they can't quite do everything that the top tiers can. It doesn't represent a different, not less. It literally represents better and worse in levels of competencies.
Well, that's I don't agree, but I understand that's how it seems to you. That was the evidence. We all feel that you can't describe everything that makes somebody a good clinician in words like this. Some things can't be measured. We're just trying to put together what we can see and what can be measured, and that was the evidence. We've masses and masses of evidence, not just from our own bodies, but from we had an what's he called, something analyst, information analyst for 18 months, one day a week, looking at everybody that we could find in the UK and in Europe and America. So
perhaps another way. Yeah, I was just going to say, perhaps another way of thinking about it is, are all trainings the same? No. And the answer is no, they're not. And sometimes that's because of issues like modality and level and stuff. But there's also, broadly speaking, from the mapping, areas that fall into clusters. And that's what the columns represent, which isn't to say, I agree with Jan, it's not about one being better than the other. In fact, if you're running a service, you'd want people from all columns, but you might not want people who don't fit into any of those columns because they've done some kind of a training that wouldn't even meet minimum standards. And I think that's one thing that we forget in the arguments about, the columns, is that actually the big advantage of setting out what our members can do is in contrast to people who don't meet those standards. And that puts us in a much stronger position to argue for opportunities to actually work with clients who need our services. And, whether we like it or not, that doesn't happen in the way that we always think it should. All of us, I think we'd all agree on that. We want to be able to work with more clients. We're not turned to when they're looking for people to work in the sort of scale that we would want them to. And that's partly because our landscape is very difficult to describe.
I think Jan is right.
Because we don't get on.
If I could just come in here, I think that Jan is right that this describes the way things are at the moment. And I think that's exactly the problem. I think anyone who's been involved in any kind of multidisciplinary team will know the pecking hierarchy that there is in the mental health field. And it's a pecking hierarchy where psychologists are subordinate to psychiatrists. And we know in the therapy world that psychoanalysts are the ones who think they have the gold standard. We have the psychotherapists somewhere in the middle of the pyramid, and we have the vast bulk of practitioners, that is the counsellors down at the bottom of the pyramid, members of BACP. The bulk of those 80% aren't even accredited by BACP. So we do have a pyramid here, we do have a hierarchy, and what the SCoPEd project does is to map it in such a way as to validate that hierarchy and make it clear that some people with certain kinds of training that they've been able to afford have the competency to do things that other people can't do. Even to the extent where we're talking about multidisciplinary teams, where only practitioners in columns B and C have the ability to work in multidisciplinary teams. So the practitioners in column A, who are at the bottom, aren't even allowed to participate in those debates. It's quite extraordinary. Underlying problem is that the columns A, B, and C, as we all very well know, are coding for counsellors, psychotherapists, and psychoanalysts. So there's a process.
No, that is not the case. Well, and it's not even on the paperwork. That's not what it says.
No, it's been taken off the paper. But you know
no. Those were never.
Guys, I'm just going to come in there because we've actually got a question on the titles. So just save that for the minute. Anyone want to?
I just want to quickly comment on the question of hierarchy, Caz. I mean, of course there are hierarchies. I don't know why we are not accepting the hierarchies. And what we are in essence talking about hierarchies within a concept which is already has a hierarchy. Because one of the hierarchy about this whole thing is somebody's a qualified counselor or somebody is not. So that's a one hierarchy. Simple as that. I know people who worked 20 odd years as a counselors, but they never did any training. The new system or SCoPEd system, they don't recognize them as counselors. We know that there are people who do 3 months online training course. The many counselors and many people who are objecting to SCoPEd project, they have a hierarchy against them. They don't consider them to be a qualified counselor. So it's a bit confusing. I mean, actually, Ian's right, and I agree with Jan, because actually, if I do see SCoPEd as a mapping process, those distinctions, those hierarchies, they already exist. Yes. There are 2 or 3 hierarchies everywhere. If you look at the example of BACP, there is a counselor and accredited counselor. That hierarchy has always been there. Look at the UKCP. They have counseling and psychotherapy hierarchy. So you pick up any example. You pick up NCS. I mean, they have 3 hierarchies. The accreditational professional, accreditational counselor, and I can't remember the all 3 and the senior one. So every system has already hierarchies inbuilt. And the one hierarchy that's bigger than all of that, which we all agree that some people are qualified to call themselves counselors and psychotherapists and other people aren't. So actually, in essence, we are beneficiaries of those hierarchies, all of us. The key question, and I know the argument about affordability is very valid argument, but if somebody does a training, 2 years training, and if you think that is outstanding gold standard training with Peter, for example, I don't know if you can hear me, and somebody else does 4 years training with Peter, are we saying that there is no difference at the end, at the exit point of those trainings? I mean, I find it very difficult, this argument, that how are you comparing that? What did that person do for those 2 years with Peter? Nothing? Are we really saying that? You can, of course, argue that people with certain backgrounds and financial availability, they managed to do extra two years, hence the system is corrupt. Well, the system is corrupt, then the same argument, somebody does 3 months online, £29 course, and somebody spends about £20,000 or £10,000 with Peter doing 2 years course. It's the same argument. So I think we can't have the both sides. Of course, there are hierarchies, and we just have to accept it.
So you're saying something there about owning the hierarchy thing.
Absolutely.
Yeah, it maps it rather than, I mean, I know that isn't meant to be a fixed point either, Ian. You know, that's one of the criticisms, that it fixes people. One of the things about the framework is that it's more enabling to help people see how, if they have done 2 years and they want to go and do further training, they can do that. And we want to actively support that and make that something that is accessible and affordable, and we can challenge that, the way those systems currently make that difficult. But to say that everyone is capable of the same roles and functions is just just doesn't stand up to the evidence, and that's got nothing to do with the different titles people use. To answer your original question, the titles are used very differently by us. I mean, the very fact, that hierarchy that you've just set out, Faisal, shows a range of titles. BPC has a whole load of titles even within its own membership. You know, how on earth can we expect people to engage with us in that kind of landscape if we haven't even got a joint point of reference? And that's effectively what the SCoPE framework is. It's about trying to establish a joint point of reference so that we can talk about what we can do, and we have it in a way that we can go and campaign and argue for all people on that framework, and for more to join it. I mean, it's not a closed shop, for goodness sake. That's the real win, if we can get some kind of a consensus on how we do that. And we haven't got it perfect. It's a long way off perfect, but it's trying to do something really important and not something destructive or limiting or stopping what people can do. It's about being able to represent ourselves all at all stages and at all levels and of all trainings. And there's a surprising amount of synergy when you actually look at the evidence.
There was.
Can I just talk about this for a second? So I know we've been on this topic for a little while, but what I find for me about this framework is calling them entry points, because whilst I'm not suggesting that somebody that does a 2-year training is covering the same content as someone that does a 4-year training, I also think the decision to map them as entry points is incorrect, because if anyone in the column C, it's when you look at the framework, it makes it seem as if they have done some of those competencies, and especially the client hours aspect of it, that they've done that as part of their placement, as part of their core training, when actually often what I've found from the UK CP courses is that when they've got to sort of 150, 200 clinical hours, they're either eligible to go and get a job, or they're actually working and gaining those hours in private practice, which is exactly in line with the courses at the other end of the framework in column A, where they are actually kind of cashing in their credits, for example, and then leaving with their qualification and going on to do CPD, whereas the people in column C are staying in a structured, ongoing, structured education plan, but ultimately you're still doing the same thing, which is gaining experience. I feel there is more common between those frameworks than it actually suggests. And where the difference is that we all agree that at that level, that 150, 200 clinical hours and various other things, personal therapy and minimum things we agree on, there's a lot that we agree on across all the modalities and all the schools. And then we diverge, and the people in column A tend to go down more CPD routes and various specialisms. And then the people in column C stay in academics. And we're giving more weight to that choice. And I actually think that's the bit for me that I don't find acceptable, because actually there is more in common with where we believe people become competent to work. I don't think you can make an entry point that is 2-3 years beyond when you're allowing them to work with the public and then say that that really is an entry point to the profession.
I don't want to hog
I say something, actually. My understanding is column C, those, as you refer to UKCP, I did UKCP training. My status was a trainee.
That's right. You're still a trainee.
The entry point is not into the profession. That's not my understanding. The entry point to that title, that you have a trainee's title until you have done those requirements.
Yeah, but my point is that that's an organizational thing that is set up by the organizations involved in this project. If you remove to the organizational thing and actually looked at the competencies, at which point, regardless of organization, you are deemed competent to be employed as a counsellor and to be working in private practice as a counsellor, there is a lot of similarities there. I appreciate that if you were on a UKCP course, you would be a trainee until you kind of got to the end of your master's and you then became a registrant. I accept that. But if we ignore all of that, those organizational things, at the core of our competencies between all the different schools and the different ideas, I actually think there's a lot there that's similar.
Okay, well, I'm just
exactly. Sorry, Caz, very quickly comment. That's very good point, actually, really good point. But this is the whole problem, Because if you imagine yourself a client or yourself somebody who wants to train in counseling psychotherapy, honestly, it's a nightmare for many trainees because they're just lucky. They're just lucky that what their Google search will bring it up when they search something. If they end up on some routes, they'll have to do 4 times personal therapy in a week to another route that there's no therapy requirement. 4 years, 5, 6 years training to 12 months training. So, or even 3 months training, some of them now delivering, and there are backdoor to some membership bodies now. Actually, it's possible that somebody can do 3 months training and can still join one of the registers. So it is actually a nightmare. So I agree with you, actually. I think you're absolutely right that who sets those points? Where does the 450 number comes? Guess my idea is usually somebody in a meeting just drop a number from somewhere.
No.
Well, I'll be really surprised, Jan, there's any research evidence that proves that if you have done 449 hours, then you are not good enough therapist. And if you've done 450 hours, now you're qualified. I mean, Jan, really, there is no such things. Most of these things, you just happen to be at right meetings saying the right things, and somebody agrees. I'd like to hear the evidence of 450 hours comes from some research.
Okay, I'm going to actually, sorry guys, I know you've got points to make, but I'm going to actually move this on because it probably fits into the next question, which is very much about what we're talking about here. Are we talking about a framework or gateways? But what I have heard today in this question is maybe people agreeing that potentially there is a hierarchy, or that this is how things are. This is actually a representation of our profession, but there's a question mark whether that's right or not. That's what I've kind of heard in some of the answers. So let's move on to the second question, which is that the original scope documentation refers to the project as a mapping exercise, whereas the most recent iteration, 2020, has introduced the idea of gateways. And the project literature indicates that many of these gateways between columns would need to be decided at a later date. So let's start with the question. How do panel members involved with SCoPE explain both the change in language and also how it may all work in practice? Let's come to Fiona first on that one.
Okay, so one of the biggest criticisms we got when we put the first iteration out was that it seemed to, going back to this issue of entry points, it seemed to lock people into a particular position on the framework. And we know, because people continue learning the moment they qualify, and that's all an entry point means, the point you qualify, that they continue to expand their capabilities through training and experience and CPD, and that the framework wasn't capturing that. And so it was giving a bit of a false picture of a lot of people being stuck at the bottom end, if you want to see it in hierarchical terms. But so mapping the gateways both acknowledged that some membership organisations have mechanisms for recognising further training and experience, which are now mapped. I mean, the BACP accreditation is one. I know there are arguments about that, but it is nevertheless one that exists. The transition in UKCP from psychotherapeutic counsellor to psychotherapist is another one. So by putting those gateway points in, it did some very important things. It recognised that there is a principle here around the framework, which is that if you continue to learn and grow through lots of different means, that ought to be taken into account. So you don't get into the ridiculous situation where if you want to train as a psychotherapist, using that term, you have to go back and start again. You know, the idea is that all of that counts towards something, and we already know that because we have mechanisms for it, but we want to find ways for that to be a principle that's built in. And actually, we also know that training organizations are very interested in this as a way of facilitating people to do what they need to do, not start again from scratch. And that's built in now. And Jan, I think, would agree that that was a real moment of recognizing that this ought to be something which changes the landscape in a way that is much more enabling.
It makes it absolutely explicit, doesn't it, that being a counsellor counts in some way to the journey to become a psychotherapist, and to be a psychotherapist counts in some way on the journey upwards to become a psychoanalyst. Now, I trained for 6 years as a psychoanalyst, so you would think that I should be delighted that psychoanalysis is at the top of the hierarchy. But I think I have to acknowledge that even though I'm committed to psychoanalysis in my own clinical practice, I've learned from the debates about cultural issues, and particularly about racism in the mental health field, that there are many approaches to mental health and mental well-being that are not psychoanalytic, that come from the personal tradition.
Absolutely, yes.
And it doesn't exclude that.
We have to understand that these different approaches are offering different things, that when we train with Peter in his course, or we train somewhere else, we learn different ways of relating to people and offering supports to people. Now, the problem with the SCoPEd framework is that it's organized in such a way that psychoanalytic conceptions are valued as the most important conceptions at the top of the pyramid, and they come to structure the whole of the pyramid.
I'm sorry.
Sorry, Fiona, very quick comment. And I don't think...
Hang on, Faisal, hang on.
How to become psychoanalytic in order to become accredited psychotherapists and to become, to know their place.
No,
I'm sorry.
Sorry.
Okay, let's go with Jan first. Jan, then Faisal.
I need to take this up with Ian, because the column C never has been and does not use the word psychoanalyst, nor would it. Because that's not.
It isn't.
It's because it's not. No, it really won't. Could you please? No, don't call me dishonesty, and that's not fair. If you could let me finish, I'll explain. Because these are competencies that go right across all different modalities. And I don't know, so I have to say, that is just not right. What you have said is just not right. And the idea that the competencies are weighted psychoanalytically is also not right. They've been carefully looked at from all different perspectives and common language. That's it. This idea that it's some sort of takeover, and I don't see that you say that psychoanalysts think they're the gold standard. Some do. Do you? And I see other psychoanalysts who have a wider experience. I'm psychoanalytically oriented myself. A wider experience of my colleagues' competencies in different areas and different ways of working. It's very disrespectful, I think, that what you're ascribing, which is not what we believe in.
One thing I'm just going to say, so just to give the facts on this, so I think we might as well just merge the titles question with this question as well. So obviously last year's iteration, columns A, B and C were referred to as counsellor, advanced counsellor and psychotherapist. So that's what it was. This year they've been replaced with A, B and C. There was also some criticism that some people felt that some of the language in column C was heavily weighted maybe towards psychoanalytic thought, which was, I believe, why there were people invited to join the ERG to represent other modalities. Who's next? Who did I say?
I also really disagree with you, and I really am confused what he's saying, because actually there are Gestalt psychotherapists in the column C. There are person-centered psychotherapists in column C. There are lots of integrative psychotherapists. And actually, if you look at the overall, HIPC is the largest college within UKCP. So the maximum numbers, they are mostly humanistic, integrative psychotherapists. So I don't know where, I think there's somebody used the phrase of psychological coup because the word of unconscious was used in the first or probably the second iteration too. There is absolute no such, I don't have this understanding, and there are Gestalt psychotherapists in column C, there are person-centered, so it's not a modality based, it's largely and mainly based on the extent of training, as I understand, which comes with other competencies that sit under there. So I think it's pretty confusing and unhelpful.
It's bad news for anyone in column A, because it says very explicitly in the second iteration, it says practitioners in column A are unable to work with unconscious and out of awareness processes. And I would be very surprised.
Ian, I think, Ian, you're picking up from social media some stuff. You're picking up from social media.
In the document.
No, it's not. It's social media.
Okay, guys, stop. Right, Fiona.
listen, it's very frustrating to hear just incorrect facts about the framework being put on this discussion, because it's not helping.
It's competence.
The divisions you described are not what's in the framework. They are not. There was never a separate column for psychoanalysts. There never has been, and there isn't now. And nor has it been exclusive to psychoanalytic tradition. We've made that very, very clear. And we've worked collaboratively to try and find a language. Now, maybe we're not there yet, but there will be counsellors who call themselves counsellors in all three columns, but not all of them will have done the same training for the same length to the same level. And I want to turn the question round and ask those of you who are so keen to destroy this collaborative working, what it is that you are so against about us agreeing a framework of shared standards when we can see the confusion that is before us.
That's what we're against. One that divides practitioners rather than brings them together.
Well, nothing divides more quickly than misinformation. And I'm sorry, but there's a lot of that.
I read you a quote from your own document. It says practitioners in column A are unable to work with unconscious and out of awareness processes. It's a direct quote from your document.
No, what it will say is that if you look at the methodology, what it will say is when we looked at the trainings at the entry point, which is generally level 4, that is not a requirement in training. That is not the same as saying people can't do it or won't do it, or if they're psychodynamically trained, probably are doing it at level A. But that's not the point. The point is that's not what's in the training standards. And that's what we've mapped. And the same issue applies to the mental health issue. You know, people have said, why are you now requiring a mental health placement? It's not that. It's that some trainings require a mental health placement. That's out there. It's not something we've invented. We've captured it in a map. And, you know, I was sitting on an expert reference group for working with people with tier 2 and tier 3 issues in the national health. They want to identify therapists who have got that kind of competence background around discourses around mental health, around having worked in you know, highly complex contexts. What's wrong with saying to them, here's a way you can help identify these people? It won't be every individual. It will be a collection of people from all backgrounds, all trainings, who've worked in those types of ways. And frankly, you know, the same applies to any other group. There'll be places for people to work which is exactly right for them, but they're not all the same. And all we're trying to do is find a way of describing that which has a common language. And if you talk about things in a common language with generic standards, you can't get into the detail of how you would put that in any particular modality or in any particular detail. That is left for people to do. It's all there.
Okay, so I'm going to let Sam come in a moment. I think we're actually on something that's really important because it's a big confusion out there, and it is to do with this mapping, and then it becomes gateways as well, because I suppose there is a question actually about, Fiona, what you're saying there is this is what we see in the mapping, but then we're also saying that other people, maybe someone like me who's been working for 10 years or whatever, can do some of those things. Yes. That's where the gateway bit comes in, but then there's quite a lot of information missing with how that side of it is going to work, which I'd like to get back onto in a moment because it feels very important. But before I do, Sam.
Well, I suppose all I wanted to come in with is this sense of there appears to be an idea that all therapists' competencies come from their training, where they trained, how long they trained. And I'm wondering, as a panel, this is what I'm hearing, this is how I'm understanding it, is a sense of people in tier 2 or tier 3 in the NHS things, they want to know what people are competent to do what, which will correlate with where they've trained or how long they've trained, etc. So I'm just interested in a panel whether we agree or disagree on the statement that therapists' competencies develop outside of training.
Yeah.
And there's no way to really map any of that.
Yes, there is.
So then what SCoPEd is doing is placing more significance on a therapist's training than there is on their experience.
Okay.
That's how I'm seeing it.
That's how. Thank you, Sam, because that's useful. Because Sam's a working as a therapist in private practice, so it's an important thing, I guess, to hear that that's how he's seeing it. I just want to read a quote now, Fiona. This is a quote from you from your recent BACP discussion that Chelsea Shelley was chairing. So this is to do with the gateways. So the quote is, the actual mechanisms and what we need to agree, they have to have credibility with our partners, they have to have functionality for us, and they have to be affordable, minimal cost to our members. So it's difficult to talk about concrete until we have an acceptance of what that framework looks like. So any comments on that quote? Fiona might want to jump in as well. But
my heart was in my mouth because I thought, God, what did I say? As we do. But yeah, I am happy to stand by that statement, and I'm happy to take comments.
Okay. So does anyone want to come in?
I don't understand. I mean, I think it's very complicated. I think I need to listen to 3 times to the quote, then I understand. But I like to respond to something that Sam said, but I'm also very conscious that Meg hasn't said anything. I'm very conscious. I like to hear Meg's views on some of these questions. I'd like to say something to Sam. My assessment is, Sam, that there are 2 kinds of people who are not in favor of SCoPEd. This is my personal assessment. And I just want to clarify one thing. I'm not representing my university or UKCP. I'm here as independent practitioner. My assessment, there are 2 kinds of people. The people belong in column C, counsellors, that they see suddenly that after 10, 20, 50 years of work, 20, 15 years of their work, they suddenly seem something very unfair. I would have felt very unfair if what Ian is saying had been correct. Had they made a policy like that only psychoanalysts would sit in this top column, everybody else who did 5, 6 years training a psychotherapist will be in the middle, I will be responding to that in a not very good positive way. So I understand that argument. But there is something else which is not very vocal. I also think that this is the first time in my 20-odd years history that UKCP, BPC, and BACP managed to sit down. And now they have also engaged with NCS and some other bodies. This never happened before. Never happened before. Actually, I do think that eventually, I might regret saying this, eventually I think that there are other hidden forces they will also pull out of this SCoPEd project. And I'll tell you why, Sam, exactly the point that you made, because the SCoPEd project actually offers a potential for people to develop competencies and move from one band to another band. Without SCoPEd project, there is no way that you can join either BPC or UKCP or Ian's psychoanalytical college. You need to go through those trainings. So actually SCoPEd project offer that a CPD route, which I have to say, and I don't know why organization like BPC is sitting there and agreeing to this project, because they would be asking 6, 7 years of training, and here somebody else does a year training, and after a couple of years or 4 years CPD work or other things, they can join that column. So there is a serious threat. So actually, if SCoPEd is successful, it offers that platform. In absence of that, I guarantee you, I cannot join BPC. I cannot. I cannot join Ian's college. But if SCoPEd is successful and there is an agreement of those competencies can be demonstrated through CPD, then I have a hope that one day, Ian might accept my application, because today he will reject it. And he knows that. So actually the hierarchies already exist. And I also think that BPC or people like Ian and all those stakeholders who wants to have this elite position, they will pull out of SCoPEd project.
Oh. I just want to ask, Meg, do you want to come in on anything around this gateway stuff?
Yeah, sorry, I just found it really hard. So it's really interesting and I didn't really want to jump in anywhere. And I guess it's kind of difficult for me to kind of provide facts on behalf of the NCS, because we have only really started kind of these conversations in very recent history. But I think it's my hope that while the project has been done so far with the three kind of main bodies, the BACP, UPC and BPC so far, and that reflects kind of their perspective and their mappings on things, I'm hoping that, and I get the genuine sense of wanting to collaborate from all of them, that this will, like the NCS's input, Human Gibbons, the ACC's input, the ACP's input will all be really valuable in looking at things like how you advance through those tiers. Those discussions are going to be really valuable as part of that. And obviously we haven't done that yet, so I don't have anything to offer about how our input will change that. But I just think that where it is now and where it is going to be are almost, it may be almost unrecognizable depending on how those conversations and how that collaboration goes. So yeah, I mean that's my input so far.
Thanks, Meg. I mean, I guess that's something that you're saying, that for the NCS, it feels very important. There's a lot of conversations about how that movement can take place. And Jan, I'm going to come to you because what Faisal was saying there, and I think this is all to do with how you do agree those mechanisms, because if we come back to that quote from Fiona, it says about kind of having credibility with our partners. So I wonder, how do you get to the point where actually, say me as a BACP member who never became accredited for my own reasons, how do you agree that I actually know enough to be able to, I don't know, move between tiers or whatever, when, and how does BACP agree with other bodies about things like that? Jan, any thoughts?
Yeah, quite a few. I thought Faisal might know something I don't know. The reason BPC won't pull out, I mean, I sit on the board over my dead body, will be one reason. They might be glad about that, but I doubt it. But I think it maybe helps to understand how the BPC is organised. We don't have direct registration. You have to be a member of a member institution. And all the member institutions are required by our requirements document to have, we call them equivalence procedures. You have to have an equivalence process so that every member institution comes into SCoPEd with the capacity to assess individuals who apply to be registered with them, and work out whether they reach the required standard, whether they have done the right amount of stuff. And I wrote that, I know exactly what's in the requirements guidelines because I wrote them. And they're required to show that somebody has reached an equivalent standard, an equivalent of psychoanalytic robustness. That's not a word in there, but you know what I mean. And they won't have to have done exactly the same thing. So somebody can come in who has had the requisite amount of personal therapy, who's had the requisite amount of supervision, maybe more, maybe less, with somebody that we recognise. And then a member institution may take them and does take them under equivalence. So I can't see why we would have a problem with it. There's always problems. Hierarchies, whatever you call them, or the Monty Python sketch about I look up to him because we're class-ridden English people mostly, but it doesn't mean we're right. And I think, as I say, I think the BPC is committed to this process because it can see this is our chance. This is our only chance. Otherwise we're all going to be irrelevant. I was telling Peter and Caz when we had the preliminary interview, I sat on the older Dykes advisory group about how to get psychotherapy and counselling into one body before there was a crisis. And that's when, because they said if there's a crisis like Harold Shipman, you'll be legislated straight over your head. It only takes one. And that's when we were going
with the DMA. Harold Shipman was registered with the British Medical Association.
Oh, I know. I know.
Him being registered, it gives us a false sense of security.
It doesn't give any sense of security. But we were told without, if there was a scandal, then we would be legislated.
Well, I can understand that you're frightened, but you need to do something else to work together instead
I'm not actually. No, now we don't interpret each other's feelings, do we, on a meeting? That's not right. I'm not frightened. I'm delighted. I think it's been a fabulous thing to do. And it may not be that great. What we've done may not be that great, but it's a whole lot better than what everybody else hasn't done.
Okay, Fiona.
I wanted to just pick on Faisal's point about talking and working together. And you know, one of the things we did in that technical group, when there was a lot of mistrust to start with, you know, everyone thought they had their own ideas, but once you actually started to look at it, but the big thing we did was to try and leave our egos outside the room. And we tried to get into a space and start a conversation. And that did an enormous amount to build mutual trust. And I don't just mean trust in individuals, but trust in our own standards. Trust in our own mechanisms for recognizing people. And we're just going through that exact process with the new members. And it's incredibly heartwarming that actually just last week we looked at the initial mapping of the new partners. And you know what? It works. And that wasn't, you know, and yet there were conceptions, oh, they're going to have lower standards. But no, they've got the same evidence. That's the potential for working together. And as I said before, I want to know what the threat is about having a joint standards framework, which is a crude, but it's a way of engaging with the external audience that we simply don't have at the moment. And some of the discussion we've had today just bears that out. I mean, how on earth are we supposed to argue for more roles for counsellors and psychotherapists when we can't even describe our membership collectively in some way? I just don't know how we do that. I can't sit in meetings and say, yeah, you've got to invite, you know, 15 professional bodies with 3 different membership titles and all of this, when actually, when you look at the evidence, there's a lot of synergy. And it's crude and it's not perfect. And there are things that have been left out, like personal therapy, because there wasn't joint on that. But it's a start. And it's worth it because that puts us in such a different position. And at the end of the day, that's for clients. It's not for our benefit. You know, so often we get accused of trying to do things which are hurtful to members. Why would we do that? When, you know, I don't understand them. Or we're going to make money out of it. Good grief. If I could drop this project and walk away just from the pure personal hassle, I would have done it 20 times.
Fiona, can I ask, because I hope everyone can hear me okay. I think I've managed to get a stable connection now. Fiona, can I ask you, talk about a lot of positives there for this project, as if it's kind of the saviour almost of the profession. Do you not think that there are massive risks with this, unintended consequences of this project, which could impact on this profession, that you're kind of not highlighting there? You're just talking about this kind of positive thing, but there is massive risks here in terms of homogenising the profession into one generic set of standards and the impact that could have on lots of practitioners.
Well, I think it's my role to give you a vision of where it could take us. I think it's for other people to say, you know, hang about, have you thought of this and have you thought of this? But on the whole, I think doing nothing does risk us being in a very even less a relevant position. You know, if you just look at how they're trying to deal with the COVID pandemic at the moment, they're looking for all kinds of other roles for people to step into the space that actually all our members are trained, qualified to work in. You know, new roles, new mental health support. It's a tragedy that those roles aren't going to our members who are able to do that work right now. And one of the reasons is because it's so difficult to represent that workforce. And if we persist in saying we're all the same, you know, we can't possibly fit into any boxes because we are therapists after all, then, you know, how on earth do we get over that? I think it's you know, there will be risks, there will be unintended consequences, and I'd love to be able to answer every single individual says what's going to mean for me, but until we have some kind of a benchmark, those details can't be spelled out.
I think,
and as for homogenisation,
that's very challenging, Fiona, isn't it? Is to say that we want to implement this, but we really don't know what impact it's going to have. And there has been no kind of impact assessment, has there, in terms of what the consequences of delivering this will have. And I think NCS, as I've asked for this as well, in terms of asking for some kind of assessment, maybe independent, to see what impact will this have on clients, on stakeholders, on therapists. And at the moment, it's a framework which is being talked about and envisaged, but it's not actually, we don't actually know what impact that's going to have. And for me, that is that's a dangerous thing, I think, to not know what is going to happen with this once it's put through.
I think also on that point, before you come in, Fiona, because in a way, I like what you say about leaving egos at the door, and the original collaboration and the new collaboration. But I think there's also something here about the fear of therapists, the real fear. I don't think that therapists, sometimes even in your answer there, I get the feeling like, if you're criticizing that, I think a lot of people are coming from a real place of fear themselves. I know for me, like, I think, well, it's all very well to talk about courage, but it feels very shaky. It's kind of like, trust us. But I'm like, when I'm in my consulting room and I ask clients to trust me, I have kind of boundaries that enable that to take place. It feels like when it's being said, just trust us and we'll work some of those details out later, that is really, really difficult for people. And I think just I don't know, I would be saying, can we have some humility around that as well, and really hearing people on those points. And even in some of the language, for example, when you talk about accreditation, the actual wording is accreditation, the word could is used. There could be another mechanism. Even that one word, it makes such a difference, because it's like, so it could or it could not, rather than there will be another mechanism. Fiona.
Gosh, a lot of points. Firstly, on the subject of humility, I've thought a lot about that word, particularly preparing for this debate. And if I've come across individually or for SCoPEd as being showing the opposite, then I'm sorry, because that's not what I intend. And I do recognise that all these things make people very fearful. And I think the question of an impact assessment is a fair cop. I think we should be thinking, not that we haven't, but we need to be thinking about impact on the wider scale. And I think that's a good challenge. And I think it's something that the new SCoPEd Oversight Committee with its expanded members could put high on its agenda, because there's impacts. It can mean impact in so many ways, can't it? It can impact on individuals, impact on our membership, impact on clients, impact on stakeholders. And I suspect that the answers to those will all be different. It will have a different impact. So I am very respectful of people's fears and of people's questions, because that's what helps us get to a better place. And one of the moments I'll never forget is meeting with a detractor, and I've met many, and realizing that actually we both were passionate about the same thing, but trying to go about it in different ways. So, as a trainer, as a therapist, how do you capture what actually happens in the room between yourself and a client, put it in somewhat a competence framework? It's a really difficult thing to do. But if we throw out the whole rational paradigm in terms of talking about what we do, then we also can't be taken as seriously as we need to be. And that idea that we're both striving for the same thing, one saying no sort of framework is ever going to do it, and me saying a framework's going to help us, was a very sobering moment, because we both cared as much, but we had different views on how to go about it. And that's why I think it's important to be humble. And I'd like to come from that place and ask people to help us with this, not just try and destroy it.
I think Meg was wanting to come in there, I think.
Sorry, Ian.
I can see Meg wants to speak.
Meg.
Yeah.
Yeah, hi. So I think from the NCS perspective, one of the important things, which kind of reflects what Peter was saying earlier, is about how do we enshrine the diversity in the profession that comes from training, but also comes from one of the key things I think about counselling, psychotherapy for me is the how individual it is based on the people practicing it, and for many, you know, this can be something of a second or third profession, and kind of how do we represent that within these discussions as well. And the third thing, or the second thing, I've lost count, is that you know, how can we make this clear that this is linked to kind of workplace competencies, and that there will be elements of counselling and psychotherapy and everything that goes around that will not kind of fit into that framework necessarily, because there is such a broad way in which people practice that just can't be captured by this kind of hundreds of different ways of practicing. And how do we acknowledge that, and how do we kind of make that really clear? Obviously, we haven't had these discussions ourselves yet, but it's something that I think that we will be talking about.
Yeah, Jan.
I wanted to also echo what Fiona said about humility. That I would like to think. I keep feeling having things ascribed to us, which you know, I don't think we've approached this task in a manner that's not humble. And if I've come across that way, like Fiona, I'm sorry. I wanted to take up Peter's point about homogeneity. Absolutely. I think we'd all feel we were much the poorer if we'd produced something that looked like everybody did the same thing, and that what's meant to happen is that it's the professional judgment, isn't it, of our senior clinicians that actually maintains the standard for people training, and our friends and our colleagues and supervisors that helps us develop and maintain how we should be maintain and develop our work. So the idea is that these are baseline, ordinary things that everybody actually, a good practitioner, will be doing, maybe described in different words, but that the essence, the humanity of it, you can't, you know, that is not homogenous. I think I absolutely agree with you, and I think that would be a terrible. I don't agree, obviously, that it's that it could be an unintended consequence, but it certainly would certainly is not an intention.
Thank you, everyone. This has been a really great question, and you know, I think it's when Peter and I were speaking with you, you said the same thing as Fiona, her conversation with someone who'd left, it sounds like, about people wanting similar things, but you know, it kind of not being in the same places or whatever. So I really appreciate you hearing Peter and I's points on that, because obviously we represent a community and we're hearing a lot of that on the ground. And coming back to us with those answers. The next question is a really, yes, Ian, yes.
I just wanted to chime in there. I do agree with Jan. I think people expect different things from therapy, and people offer different things in therapy. We've got to find a way of enabling our field of work to operate in such a way that the kinds of support that people look for can be made available to them. It might not even come from therapy, it might come from gardening or spiritual practices or other kinds of activity, and we've got to be open to that as well. People grow and develop in many different ways, and I suppose my worry is that when we're trying to capture what happens as a therapeutic practice, we thereby define therapeutic work as being one kind of thing, one kind of net covers everything. So I think we've got to be humble about what we're doing as just one kind of practice.
Thank you, Ian.
Can I just make one point about this question before we move on? I'll be quick. Because actually sitting here listening to everything that's been said, we seem to have moved to somewhere in this debate where the acceptance of a hierarchy is just what it is, and that we do have a class system in this country, and it might not be right, but that is what we're working with. And I actually think a lot of the criticism about this framework is the fact that there's quite a big movement on the ground, especially if you tend to find yourself in column A, to change that. And we shouldn't be following those same routes. We shouldn't be fighting for those same positions in the NHS, and we shouldn't be doing that. And that seems to have been lost, because all of the answers, which have been very good, they've helped, you know, for me listening to them for sure. But a lot of it's been talk about the positions that you are losing in the NHS, and that actually you need to kind of ring fence them and secure them, when most of the column A people are kind of working in the community. And we haven't spoken at all about how SCoPEd affects or impacts or changes where the majority of therapy happens, because by the time any clients reach NHS services, there's usually, you know, years, if not decades, of suffering preceding getting through all those gateways to reach those therapists. And all the time that that's happening, it's people like me and others in column A that are holding all the crisis outside, and that is not reflected at all in this framework. So as regards to class, I feel it's, you know, I don't think it's acceptable for us to just say this is the system that we're in and therefore we're going to mold ourselves to fit. We need surely we need to be broader than that and saying, you know, we need to be looking at how we want it to be different. And if we can't influence that in the NHS as a stakeholder, then why we need to be broadening that out with the public and out with the community and out with the social services. But
thank you, Ashleigh. I know
longer than I thought, but
no,
I was it for a while.
I'll tell you why it's great what you've just said, and I know other people want to come in. And actually, there's going to be a question on employment in a minute where we look at the different sectors. So you might want to add points there. But this is really great because it leads us into what I think is a very, very important question. And it's one that actually on our previous debates, we've had kind of a general consensus across the board on about concerns. Okay, so it's on diversity. So there's been a great deal of discussion around how SCoPEd may impact on diversity and inclusion within the profession. Okay, so this question is actually two parts. So the first part of the question is, how will SCoPEd impact on diversity and inclusion within the profession? And secondly, do you think that some of the language used within the framework columns in itself is culturally sensitive? And I'm actually going to come to Ian first because Ian's obviously representative of the PCP. So Ian.
Well, it has been an issue that's been raised in our discussions in PCP about SCoPEd. If we think about this hierarchy, and I think we've pretty well agreed that there is a hierarchy. The hierarchy is being reflected and reproduced in some way in this project. What we have at the bottom of the pyramid, at the bottom of the pile, are people who are more likely to be working class, more likely to be people of colour, more likely to be women. And as you go up the hierarchy, you see the men starting to take control until you get to the top, and it reproduces power structures that are evident in society. And what we've learned from movements that have been challenging power and discrimination, especially in the last few years with the emergence of the Black Lives Matter movement, we've learned that there's been a greater emphasis on experience, that we learn something about power from people who are at the bottom of the hierarchy rather than people who are speaking from the top. Now, the problem with the SCoPEd framework is that it says very clearly that only practitioners in column C, and I know you'll tell me that it's not psychoanalysts and there are lots of other people in column C and it's not layers, but okay, only practitioners in column C have the ability to communicate about the harm caused by discriminatory practices and aim to reduce insensitivity to power differentials within therapeutic service provision, training, and supervisory contexts. Only practitioners in column C is quite incredible. And it says elsewhere in the document, it says very explicitly, therapists in column A, that is the vast majority of practitioners, cannot use their own responses to the client or patient in a way that is therapeutic. That is, what the SCoPEd framework does is it runs against the whole way in which people are starting to learn about the importance of expertise from experience and valuing people's own experience of oppression as they've been drawing attention to discriminatory practice. So we know very well from the sociological research that psychoanalysis, psychotherapy, and counseling is embedded in class structures and other kinds of power structures. So the question is, what kind of mapping are you doing, or what kind of research are you doing into the way that this is reproduced? I should finish by pointing out that you also say in the scoped framework that only column C practitioners will have the ability to integrate relevant theory and research in the areas of diversity and equality into clinical practice. Again, you're cutting out and reinforcing barriers against the vast majority of practitioners.
So I'd like to speak to this issue, and again, I do so humbly. I think one of the things that you might pick out from the scope framework is how much attention has been given to try to thread issues around diversity and inclusion throughout, rather than, as we know, it's often part of training added on, or just dealt with in a superficial manner. And the actual structure with the 5 themes means that every theme addresses that at every point. You can pick out a particular criteria and say, well, integrating research or whatever. That's what the mapping showed, that we engage with it in different ways according to the level and length of the training. There are others in column A and column B that speak to power, that speak to discrimination. They're just not phrased in that particular language. And the ERG took particular focus on this because of the woeful state of many of our trainings of not addressing that properly. Now, I'm sure there's more work to be done. Those draft criteria, need probably more work on that, particularly around the Black Lives Matter, which has put race at the forefront in a way that it isn't signalled here. We've used a more general statement, but again, a lot of trouble went to find a phrase that would capture everything about how we are different. In terms of the training, this is so interesting. This was one of the points. So we know, because of the landscape of our field, that there is more diversity at the column A. We know that if you go and do a diploma in an FE college, you're more likely to have a more diverse group economically, socially, racially, culturally, in every respect. And that is one of the reasons why Scoped is so different from what other professions have done as they've tried to organise themselves, which is to say, oh, let's make it a degree and let's make it expensive and let's make everybody jump through a high bench mark at a high academic level. The Scope project recognises exactly that people come into the profession with life experience, wounded healer if you want, trauma of their own, and they transform that into a way of being which is therapeutic to others. And the Scope framework says, that's great. Come through this door. You can show that you meet the standards you do already. But it also says, we need to find a way to help you continue that. And I cannot think of a more profound way of trying to enable that diversity to go up to column C than by saying, you don't have to go back to the beginning. You haven't got these doors shut to you. You're barred from it. It's going to cost you a fortune. It's the exact opposite. It's the most powerful way I can think of to keep that tradition of people coming in from those very diverse backgrounds and increase it and help in ways that are genuinely inclusive to make us more diverse. That's one of the aspirations of the framework.
And I just wanted to add to it, Ian, you keep saying, when you're quoting it, as if we have said only people are allowed to do this, which we're not. That isn't what is ever said. Nobody's saying people in other columns don't do this. This is the evidence from all the training and other evidence we've gathered, masses of evidence about how it is described. Not that people in other columns may not do these things, but these are
precisely the problem. You're taking what you describe and then you're ending up putting it in a grid. You're reflecting and reinforcing what it is you're describing. You're reflecting
that's a map.
Power differentials in the world. That's
Ashley's point. Ashleigh's point about the column A people is a very, very important one, Ashleigh.
Yes, absolutely.
All that work that goes on now, those people should be paid by our public services for that work. They shouldn't all have to be working in private practice to make a living. And one of the powerful arguments, again, around SCoPEd is that we have evidence in a way that is explainable to external audience as to why that is a travesty that that's not happening. So for the NHS, for example, the requirements around having to be accredited, having to do an IAP training are there because that's their way of trying to make sure they get the right people for the right jobs as they see them. But we now have the evidence to go back and challenge that, and we are doing that, and we've got evidence of that having an impact, where we're saying if you've done a training that meets what you need to work with people before they reach a point of absolute crisis, then you should be employing them as part of your workforce. But not everybody in the same roles, but as part of the workforce to keep people from getting more unwell or more distressed. And that's where the opportunity lies in making those arguments. There's nowhere written down that I know of about what column A therapists can do except in SCoPEd.
But Fiona, the way you're describing that there is that you're acknowledging that the people in column A work with more a range of diversity in some roles, and yet those people are going to be at the bottom of this hierarchy, and therefore so they have to work their way up to the top. And what you're talking about there is a complete imbalance around these different columns, and that people need to start at the bottom and then work their way up, and that to me kind of seems really, really unbalanced to me.
But why nobody has to do anything? They can stay.
You don't have to, but you're certainly implying that if you want these positions or you want these paid positions, that you should be encouraged to do that. So you're not.
No, I'm saying you should be paid at the first point. I'm saying you should be paid at the first point.
I agree with that. In answer to what you were saying about my comment, I do agree with that. I do dispute this idea that there are waves of sectors that don't understand what we do, because there's 60,000 members between the previous three groups involved, organizations, and the majority of them are working. It's just the majority of them are working for nothing. So these companies know what we do and they know what we valued. They just don't feel they should have to pay us. There's entire organizations and empires being built on therapists that are working for free when everyone else in the organization is being paid. Personally, and this is just my personal opinion, I don't believe that SCoPEd actually achieves what you want it to in regards to challenging IAPT and us being able to have a foot in the door there, because they've made their decision about the type of therapist that they want. I also think that the public don't have an expectation that they should have access to a therapist. And so it's very easy for stakeholders to not provide that because people will prioritize other things. I feel for me that we should be concentrating more on the public and communities and building that expectation that people should have access to a therapist, rather than trying to wedge ourselves into this small little space available in the NHS.
Okay, Faisal.
I think I've probably defended enough SCoPEd. I'm going to change the side now. I do agree with Ashleigh, I have to say. I completely agree. My biggest criticism to SCoPEd project is that it's confusing. It's confusing to me. Is it a training mapping document, or is it a professional framework? And I think sometimes, Fiona, when you speak, or when actually then it mixes up to me when how I hear. Is it if it's primarily a training document telling the potential students that these are the different routes, you do 2 years, 3 years, 4 years, whatever the training is, and these are the kind of roughly the competencies that you will cover on your training, and let them decide which route they want to choose. If it was a training document, then to be honest, none of us or most people who engage in this debate, it's not for them, because it doesn't impact me. I trained many years ago. So I think it's confusion about, and I think actually your point that do we know that this document will change anything in terms of employment? To be very honest, I don't know. I don't think so personally. The reason I say this, I think the biggest scandal in this profession in the last 20 years is IAPT project. What happened? And my And the previous generation, I'm probably too old to call somebody else a previous generation, I really think that they have a lot to answer. My trainers, my supervisors, my therapists, most of them middle class, most of them white British, most of them lived in a, massive big houses and actually didn't want to engage the world out there. I remember hearing from trainers, tutors, saying, well, we have nothing to do with that kind of world, the people who have salaries. We don't want counselors in salaries. I heard tutors saying this. They are the problem. And the same people, they kind of seep in other forms of shapes and try to do now things. IAPT is the biggest scandal. How on earth the government decides to invest millions and billions of pounds, retrain nurses, retrain new people, and ignore thousands of already qualified counselors. Now, somebody must be responsible for that. I think BACP, UKCP, BPC, NCS, all of them are responsible. And in addition to that, people like myself, Ian, and Peter, and all those people who are in training institutes doing training, we all are responsible for that mess. Because we should not have allowed that. And my personal assessment is, I used to manage a service some time ago. When I first started, 90% of the staff were counselors. And in 6 years' time, only 5% of the workforce were counselors. People stopped recruiting counselors. So I think we must think carefully. Who was the real responsible for the mess of IAPT? We cannot simply blame government. We cannot simply say, oh, somebody sitting there in London, they decided that. I have to say, and I genuinely believe, the people in our camp, the people within the counseling and psychotherapy profession, they did not want to engage in that debate. They wanted to be so different sometimes, everything other. This is the height of racism when we talk about diversity. There's something that is not like me. We label them. Either we psychologically diagnose them or we politically diagnose them. Anything that's not acceptable is racist, Islamophobic. I mean, I heard people saying SCoPEd is Islamophobic. I mean, or racist project. So my final line on this is, Caz, and I'm talking a lot on this theme. I think there should be some kind of a committee that people look into the reasons how on earth thousands well-qualified counselors were ignored and who was responsible. And we cannot just blame Parliament for that. People like myself, people like Peter, and people like organizations like all the sitting here, they were equally responsible and they must be accountable for that mess.
I have to speak. I was there.
Go, Jan.
I'm very old. I was at the conference. I have spoken to Layard myself, and I was pretty cross. Actually, it's partly government's fault, but BACP, UKCP, BPC, and other organisations protested mightily. We were told by the head of NICE, famous in Newcastle for never having seen a patient since 1990, some medic, that we were children squabbling over the Christmas presents. And we were stabbed in the back by our colleagues, actually. It was because we didn't work together that some, particularly the psychologists, went with IAPT and other colleagues. We were a divided group, and we could not prevail. And believe me, I was there. We tried. You're speaking to the woman who nearly hit Lord Layard. I was so cross. And as you can see, I'm still cross. I absolutely agree with you. I think IAPT's been a disgrace.
Thank you. You know, this is so important, I think, to scope about the history of our profession. For anyone who's not aware, talking about conversations in the past around the regulation of our profession. So yeah, I'm sure people can read up a little bit more on that, but there's been some really interesting things to think about, actually. I just want to come back to the original question that is obviously tied up with all of this. I have got a couple of statements from a couple of organisations which I guess represent minority cultural groups within our profession. I'm just going to read them both, and people can comment on either or preferably both, actually. And the first one is for Fiona, Jan and Meg specifically. So it's from Counsellors Together, CTUK. They would like to ask if you would be willing to appoint an expert in equality, diversity and inclusion to independently evaluate the scoped framework to ensure bias, privilege and blind spots are flagged up. We believe this should not be an afterthought, but should be central to the development of the framework. So that's the first one, and they do a lot of work focusing on the prevalence of unpaid work in our profession. The second one is from Dominic Davies of Pink Therapy. So he is asking, how will SCoPEd assess the competency, skills and cultural sensitivity of therapists to fulfill the obligations inherent in the Memorandum of Understanding on Conversion Therapy, version 2, which all of the MB's membership bodies have signed up to?
Do you want to?
Both very good questions, touching very important subjects. One thing you might want to know is that we are part of the new governance will include experts by experience, and that's bringing the client voice in. That doesn't directly address the issue around diversity. I think, as I said, we did have particular guidance on the ERG, but it's for all of us to address that issue, and maybe that's a way of going about it. So I'm certainly not closed to that idea personally, and I would hope it again could go on to an agenda for further discussion. In terms of Dominic's question, he asks how will SCoPE assess? Well, SCoPE won't say how, but it hopefully will say a little bit about what needs to be assessed, and that's, as I said or alluded to before, that's something that is there in the framework, and if it's not there in the framework, then we need to have another look. But I would argue that the MOU, those values are enshrined in the SCoPE framework, but I can't off the top of my head know whether that's listed as one of the sources that was looked at right at the beginning, but we could certainly have a look at that. I do want to say a quick word about IAPT, but maybe I'll hold on to it.
Hold on to it. We're going to come to employment section next. So Jan, Meg?
I agree with Fiona. Meg, have you got more you could say?
I just want to say definitely would be willing to explore the equality, diversity and inclusion aspect with everybody. And for me, I can't really comment on the memorandum of understanding side of things, especially as we're so new to the project, but again, would be really happy to look at that. The MOU2 is part of our code of ethics. So I would imagine that any work that we do obviously will reflect our code of ethics and would therefore be reflected in there as well.
Thank you. Thanks, Meg. Right. Anyone else got any further points on this question before we move on? Okay. Peter, can you hear us, Peter?
I can hear you fine. I'm hoping you can hear me. Thank you for holding the fort, Caz, while I've dipped in and out. Hopefully I'll be here for the rest of the debate. So our next question, when we have touched on some of this already, is around employability and the impact that SCoPEd is going to have on that. But the question we kind of wanted to kind of put out there was around, what do panelists think the impact of SCoPEd will be on within different employment contexts? So say, for example, maybe the NHS versus university settings. Obviously, Faisal was talking about IAPT there. So what do panelists think about the impact that SCoPEd will have on employability? Meg, can we come to you first?
Yeah, absolutely. Impact on employability. That is a good question. I mean, for me and for the NCS membership, we have only recently had recognition in terms of kind of some of the larger organisations. So for the past kind of forever, really, we've been fighting for parity of esteem for NCS members. So It's going to be interesting to see how that develops. A lot of our members are in private practice, so I think perhaps one of the questions that we'll be asking our members is obviously, however this framework turns out, is it something that, one, affects them, and two, is it something that they want to apply to their own practice? Because I think, many members who aren't interested in working for an organisation may not wish to map themselves onto that. So, yeah, I don't know. It's a funny question for the NCS, I think, because of the way that our membership is currently made up.
But do you have a view on do you think SCoPEd will increase employability for therapists or not? Do you have a view on that?
I can't even begin to guess on behalf of the NCS. I mean, I guess the hope is that yes. The hope is that yes, it would within the larger organisations by providing clarity. I've heard a lot of different perspectives here today. But I think there's a hope from this project, which I get from the other organisations involved, which is that by giving some more clarity to what it is that we do as a profession in a very kind of limited sense, that applies to kind of the workforce, then perhaps that will translate into more organisations being able to offer roles.
Thank you.
I have a wondering about that. Is why would an organisation want to employ column A instead of column B or instead of column C? What do you think would motivate an organisation to employ column A instead of the other?
They'd be cheaper. They'd be cheaper. That's what.
Cheaper or free?
As we've been talking,
definitely not free. No.
Okay.
I'm sitting here listening to this, and obviously we've made it part of the vision is that it would increase employment opportunities, particularly people in column A who often are expected to work for free, which is quite wrong. But there's also part of me thinking, good grief, SCoPEd cannot solve all the ills that we face. And, as Faisal's talked about things that happened historically, the IAPT program and its limitations, although it did open up therapy to a lot of people who had no access at all before in its limited way. We can't solve all the employment issues. We can't solve the structural inequalities. We certainly don't want to make any of those worse, and we hope that we will make them better. But, I'm just trying to inject a note of realism here. But what it does do is gives us an opportunity to make those arguments more powerfully than we've been able to do before. So if going back to the NHS for a moment, my aspiration is that, the NHS is a huge employer, but it's not the only employer by a long chalk. But they, getting arguments won there will actually signal other possibilities. The opportunities in health and social care, which after all are still statutory services, that's another route for counsellors and psychotherapists. If you think about the wave of bereavement we've gone through, so bereavement services, there's all kinds of services that aren't IAPT that ought to be employing counsellors and psychotherapists. And we've always made that point and asked the question about why not. And as I say, I think this gives us an opportunity to make those arguments more powerfully. The proof of the pudding will be in the eating, whether we do succeed in doing that. But, one of the reasons why IAPT is important is because it's a signal, and because you have two choices in life, don't you? You either say, I won't have anything to do with that, and you walk away, or you stay involved in the hope that you change people's minds. And I get laughed at for saying that. But I have seen things change from going to meetings over and over and making the same point till people are sick to death. There's that bloody woman from BACP saying, what about jobs for counsellors again? And I do it at every meeting. And we've had some meetings now where people are beginning to take an interest in that. And we have got a meeting tomorrow with a stakeholder, psychological professional stakeholder, talking about removing barriers for counsellors and psychotherapists into the NHS. That's now a work stream. It's written into the vision for psychological therapies. And one of the reasons for that is because we are gaining a lot of respect for the work we're trying to do, to work together on shared standards. We've presented the scope framework to that group. It got a lot of interest. It got us a meeting with the head of strategy at HEE, when I was able to talk about, working with the whole person rather than treating a problem. You know, the NHS always looks to recruit people to deal with a problem, you know, obesity, whatever the latest issue is. But actually, we work with people. We have very, very diverse people. And you know, that's a very different dialogue, a very different way of approaching things, which is just not how the NHS works at the moment. So that's why it's worth staying involved, and that's why it's worth saying. And your point, Meg, is you wouldn't have had to make all those difficult arguments if we'd had a shape framework. You could have just gone and said, we map to this, whether we like it or not. This is where the benchmark is at the moment. You should be employing our therapists, and we would have all said we agree. And as it was, you didn't have that option. You had to fight and fight and fight, and you know, we got accused of keeping people out and, you know, protectionism and all of that. But actually, those decisions weren't made by us. It was because there's no other way of negotiating the landscape. Oh, if we go for accredited, at least we know something. You know, that's what's going to get turned over by having a more comprehensive framework with all its imperfections. And it will also have to evolve. You know, it's a mapping, it's how we are in time, but it will have to evolve to be something that does move on and deal with issues that we need to deal with, and becomes a way of raising training standards and raising opportunity and raising employment. It's not ever going to be a fixed thing.
Could I also pick up Sam's particular question? I absolutely agree with what Fiona said, is why would you employ somebody out of column A rather than column C as for other reasons? Then they're cheaper. Well, it depends what you want them to do. Or there's all kinds of things where what you'd need is somebody from column A, for instance. Why would you not be able to look at what you need somebody to do, and then employ the person to employ the person to do it? Speaking personally, when I'm allocating, which sometimes happens to me, so I'm mostly in private practice, I'm looking for the right person that I think would be able to offer what the person needs. I'm not looking for everybody has to go and see a psychoanalyst or even a psychoanalytically informed practitioner. Depends what they need and what I can help them find. So that's the other answer to the question. It depends what we want them to do.
There is a risk there, Jan, though, isn't there, in terms of if we are trying to match clients to therapists through this framework. How can we do that at the initial stages of knowing a client? How are we going to know exactly what they need? And that's something that counselling and psychotherapy has always been quite good at, in terms of we meet our client in relationship and we figure out what that's going to be like as we go along. Yeah. I suppose my worry is
I'm not disagreeing with that. Yeah, that wasn't really the point I was making. Yeah, sure.
No, I know it wasn't the point you were making, but I think there is the potential for that within this framework, that actually it's used in that kind of way to kind of match clients up with therapists in a kind of arbitrary way based on these standards that have been put together.
I can't tell that would work.
The bigger problem is that the question of the market for jobs takes priority over what the question of psychotherapy is and what the question of support is. So they've got a set of criteria for what the job of therapist is, and we persuade organizations to accept those criteria. And then as a mirror process, we're persuading therapists that they accept that there are particular competencies that they should use to describe what they're doing. So the two things lock together. And when that happens, we lose sight of the particular things that people need and the particular things that people can offer. And it goes back again to the question that Ashleigh raised earlier about the massive work that is happening in the community outside organizations by people who aren't employed at all. And we find in our different training organizations, and I know I've supervised people in different training organizations and examined work of different kinds, of counseling psychologists and clinical psychologists and psychotherapists and counselors. I know very well that there have been challenges from people coming from different communities that we have with us today. We have people coming from different communities who have questions about what these competencies are and have offer innovations in practice which challenge those competencies. And the danger is that if you set in place a strict grid of job descriptions and job competencies, then you lock out that innovation and that different kind of practice that is giving something new to the field of psychotherapy every day.
Well, good luck with that, because my joyful experience of working with psychotherapists and colleagues over 40 years, it's like herding cats. I do not, in a good way, I do not think anything that any of that can really affect how people are fundamentally in the room with somebody else. And I think there are dangers in not having something written down. Equally.
There's also a sort of assumption here that, you know, that these are people with opportunities. The fact of the matter is that most of the clients don't get these opportunities to work with a therapist. It's not as if we're going to destroy something that exists. The opportunities aren't there at the moment, and that's one of the big intentions to shift that. But going back to this thing about fixing things, you know, the SCoPEd is only looking at core training. It's not looking at all the many other things people do. Think of all the specialisms people have and the areas of expertise that they develop over time. You know, the ethical framework, the BACP one, asks us all to work within our competence. So, you know, if you're in private practice, for example, you make decisions about who you work with every day, don't you? And you say, actually, that sounds like something that I'm not the best person, and you refer on, or you say, yes, this is right up my street, I can help here. That doesn't change. It's not about stopping people doing. Your competence will always be more than the sum of SCoPEd. And there was a big debate recently about long-term, short-term. Well, SCoPEd doesn't speak to that. It's not trying to be as powerful as people imagine it is. But it would be quite useful as a private practitioner, which I have been for many years, as well as working for GP practice and in other contexts, is to sort of is help you sort of think about where you are on that. It's not about someone coming in and stopping you doing something. And you know, I had a very vivid recollection of taking on a client when I was newly qualified, who should have been working with someone in column C, and I absolutely was not equipped. And I was very, very damaged by that experience. Somebody with borderline personality disorder and all kinds of quite aggressive things, which I didn't spot because I didn't have the training and experience. And that to me is, you know, that's my personal responsibility. That's not about somebody stopping me doing something that I can't do.
Faisal, do you want to come in there?
Yeah, I think, Fiona, I think Peter made an interesting comment early on, and that's about the impact assessment. And I think, Fiona, it's a really interesting comment that you just made, that it's not as powerful as some people think it is. And I wonder that if you and other partners, you have kind of underestimated the impact of SCoPEd on your members. I wonder that there's something somewhere happened that it became much more bigger in some ways than perhaps it was intended. You keep saying that there's a lot of flexibility and there's a lot of potential, but somehow it's not, people are not hearing that. There's a lack of trust, there's lack of belief, that because of course it's one thing what you say on a panel like this, and there's something else what's written in those columns. And of course, when people have to make an assessment of how they feel about this project, they look at the document, not that what just Fiona said, because it can't be quoted. So I do think that it's, to me, I still find slightly confusing this document. Is it a training document? Is it a professional framework? I think it would be helpful. to maybe either separate these two things, or maybe just to say, well, these are the agreement between these 5 or 7, I don't know how many member bodies now join, and this is a common agreement of the training routes available to people. And let's do work differently about the professional framework. Caz, your question about employability, I say 2 things. I worked as a service manager for many years, worked quite closely with commissioners and NHS. There are 2 sources of funding in this country, well, 3, but 2 main: NHS funding, local authority funding, and third one is a private sector funding. Private sector funding never funds in this country a system that can employ thousands of counsellors. That's not going to happen. You might get a small project here and there, but that's not what we should aim for or hope for. There are 2 sources of funding. With the Public Health England becoming centralized, there's a very limited funding by the local authorities. They might launch a project which will allow 3 counsellors in a region, 10 counsellors in a region maximum. I don't see that happening because NHS, they've taken on the mainstream of mental health funding. This is why I feel so cross and so angry about IAP situation. I am not optimistic about the job market in terms of counselling. Really, I'm not. I think what could or should happen is that we need to work really hard to engage with mental health services and make sure that at least 50% of IAP's funding is allocated to non-CBT or to members of BACP, BPC, and NCS, and all these bodies. So that's the big fight that we have to fight. But there is a problem. The problem is, as soon as I say this word that we need to work with mental health colleagues, there are some people within my own profession, they don't like it. They don't like the word as soon as I mention the mental health, because they say, well, I don't believe in this hierarchy of mental health. I don't believe in this diagnosis. I don't want to work with people who have outcome measurements. They sit so comfortably in their very cushioning and very 3-story building houses, and they want to lecture other people how and what they should do. Let people decide. Let counsellors and psychotherapists decide if they want to work with an NHS sector or not. There are many counsellors who want to work. There are many counsellors. How I see that what my previous generation didn't offer to me, what I want to do as a trainer, that I want my students in a better position next year, in 2 years' time, so there are greater job opportunities for them. And I really want those professionals, those trainers, and those kind of gurus to really think the implications, what they're really preaching. That as soon as you use the word of mental health, as soon as you use the word of any kind of this system, they bring a strong political views to stop that. This is where we were 20 years ago when IAP started happening, and this is where we are now. We haven't changed at all. So I think that's the only option in terms of employability. And I still think, Fiona and Meg, I know you joined that, and Jan, I think SCoPEd, to me, doesn't really answer the employability question. If the IAP's happening today, I don't think the SCoPEd's ready or offer that solution to that problem, that we can show to IAP providers that counselling psychotherapy is a profession you can trust on this profession.
Just a very quick point, Ashley. We've got 2 more questions left that are really important to fit in. So yeah, very quick point.
Okay, so my point was just as being someone who wouldn't want to really work with those mental health people, and being one of the ones that politically might be more adverse to that, I find that interesting because I'm quite happy for counsellors to want to work in those environments and seeing their place in that entirely. But I think that's quite dismissive on their side to say that there's no other way to do this. If we've been doing this for so long this way, by trying to target the mental health area and find our place in there, I don't think that it is unrealistic or a bit of a dreamer to say that there are alternative options and that we should be looking to alternative places. And just for clarity about my point here, I'm a parent I have a son, a quite profoundly disabled son who had a stroke in the womb when I was pregnant, and we are part of that mental health area. So as a service user, I make the decision not to work in it because I see as a service user it's not a good fit. But I do respect, even with those views, other people's decision to want to work there, and I support BACP entirely in wanting to encourage that. But I'm fighting for the fact that I feel community and other options are missing from that framework.
Actually, I didn't mean to say that the opposition was about to agreeing to IAP outcomes-based discussion. I said that people refuse to even sit down to discuss potential, and this is where we missed the boat.
I appreciate that. I think that's their prerogative, I suppose. I think it's that if they don't want to do that, that's disappointing, but I don't think we necessarily have to think about them like that.
Thousands of counsellors suffering because of those decisions.
Are thousands of counsellors suffering purely because they won't talk to people in mental health? No, I think thousands of clients are suffering in the community because we don't have a big enough base community area. Actually, that would be mine. I suppose I just wanted to stand up for people that are not wanting to align themselves with mental health, of which I would include myself. But I certainly respect other people's right and other training and other modalities that want to do that. I don't think there has to be an either or. But we need to be taught. So
I think disunity is one of the biggest gifts to our critics.
I think this disunity is one of our biggest strengths. It's what makes therapy what it is. And
diversity, yes, but not disunity.
I can see that you want things to be open so that people in the different columns A, B, and C can make choices about what they're doing. But when you specify what the competencies are and hand them over to employers and advertise these competencies as competencies that therapists should aim to train for, then what you do is you hand over the decisions to those employers. The problem is bigger than us, and you're complicit. You're complicit in that process when you should be challenging it. We should all be challenging it.
Ian, there will be people who will never want to put counselling in any sort of framework. But we do have the example of PCE-CFD, which found a place in the NHS from a person-centred tradition. And that was a very difficult thing to do, and it was a very commendable thing to do because it's a foothold. So it is possible to work within rational paradigm frameworks and to deliver therapy with heart and integrity. So I would dispute that. In terms of the future, fixing things, one of the things that's built into the terms of reference for the SCoPE framework is its ongoing maintenance, if you like. That's not quite the right word, but to make sure it remains relevant and to make sure it remains helpful. So it's not just a one-off thing that ceases, it fixes things. It's about continuing to grow and change as we do. Your point earlier about other people coming in, and maybe there will be other bits of it at some point. I really don't know, and I wouldn't want to presuppose that. In terms of the issue of whether it's a professional framework or a training framework, I don't really see how you can completely separate the two, Faisal. I appreciate that just to say it's training is possibly less controversial, but there's a consequence for how and where you trained and the length of it, which does speak to a professional framework. So, I think I don't think that's possible to separate them in the way you hope. That's just a lot of quick answers. Sorry.
Yes, I was going to say, and I know Peter might want to come in with a point here, but I was just going to say, on this point around employability, I don't know, just for me with this question, there's so many different factors involved in it. It just feels really complex from what I've heard. Peter, did you have something to add?
Well, one of our questions actually was kind of moving on, and I think people were leading into this question actually there by some of the points that they were making around what is a therapist supposed to do who philosophically kind of does not agree with SCoPEd at a fundamental level, does not agree with this project. What is a therapist of that view supposed to do in these circumstances? Because at the moment it seems like that nearly all the membership bodies are collectively working on this project, and so there is no kind of home for people to go to in terms of they just fundamentally disagree with it.
But if you don't, I do agree there's some people with philosophical objections, But if you don't, if you philosophical objections, I mean, by definition, what sort of home would you need? Because actually, nothing will happen, will it? I mean, we don't have statutory regulation, and it's absolutely fine to carry on working independently and not subscribe to any of these things if you don't want to. I mean,
Jan, that's very difficult, isn't it, to say that we would have a standardised competency framework across all membership bodies that members do not have to subscribe to. I mean, that to me that sounds like an impossible thing there. I can't see that happening.
Sam, do you want to come in?
Well, yeah, because this idea where it's a philosophical thing, I don't need a home, but I do need to earn a living. I do have a family to provide for, and my paid employment is based on the condition that I'm a member of the BACP. My directories online are on the condition that I'm with a membership body. So if all the membership bodies come together on this, effectively I haven't got a home, if I disagree with it philosophically, and then I have a choice of, well, trying to fight the fight on my own or submitting to the authority as it's imposed.
I do understand that.
A great choice.
I get that, yeah. I don't.
I agree with Sam. I think once, if it's agreed, if it's launched, I think that's it. You know, it's just like an ethical framework of a membership body. You don't have a choice to say, excuse me, I don't agree with a section 3.5 of this, I accept rest of it. You know, it's a contract that you will have with that membership body, and you. So I think that I have no two views about that. I think it will be what it will be. But I genuinely think, this is one of my final words on this. I have this prediction. I don't think it will go ahead. Eventually, I think it will stop, and it will stop for the wrong reason. I honestly, genuinely hear the criticism and issues. I genuinely agree with some of them, not all of them. But I think it will stop for the wrong reason eventually. And that would be a shame. I'll give you a quick example. I don't know how many people know about Islam. There are different sects in Islam, and I study them very carefully for all sorts of different reasons, like Shia, Sunni, and there are other ones as well, Wahhabis. And every now and then they talk about this disunity. They said we should come together, and if we should come together as Muslim, community, then nobody can really control us. And then they fight, and then they go and split into, and they spend years and years fighting between them. And they all claim, these 70-odd sects, they all claim that they have the right to ultimate truth or ultimate God, and other ways are wrong ways of going about things. And then every now and then, after a big fight, they all kind of try to come together, and it stays for a very short space of time until there are political reasons. Remember, disunity contributes in paying not just the people outside of this group, it also pays to a lot of people who are benefit within the system. There are more people benefit, and I mean it, there are more people who benefit from this disunity within the current system. I genuinely believe this. And if it's ever successful, it will remove a monopoly of certain bodies completely. It's actually a way of dealing with many issues we talked about, employability and diversity, but it's not going to happen. I really believe that it will stop one day because one of the big players will pull out because it doesn't suit them. It doesn't suit a lot of people for a lot of reasons, and usually two reasons: political reasons and financial reasons. There are great financial benefits of this disunity and infight, and this will prevail than joining together. There is less of benefit of those big forces if it comes together. So I think people just need to slightly chill, and because it will come to stop.
How depressing.
I hope you're right, Faisal. I really hope you're right.
Because it does benefit certain people.
What would you suggest as an alternative? Just the status quo?
I think, Fiona, I think the people who are part of SCoPEd, I think you must accept that the impact is much greater than perhaps you sometimes realize. And So that's the one thing. The realization will change something. I think what's supposed to be a mapping should have been a true mapping. What does mapping mean? That you send somebody out there and say, well, let's look at how racist people are, people who live in Birmingham. And this person comes back and they say, well, I met with 10 people. I think about 3 of them are really racist, 3 just in the borderline, and 4 or 5 are them. So we don't start challenging, hating that messenger, because that messenger's job was just to go out, do the research, and come back and tell us. What's happening here? Scoped body became a target of all the attack, that you are creating this division. So I don't know how much is this the people who are attacking you is taking part, and how much is that you doing something that you have probably not remained true to the process of either research or mapping. So I still think that perhaps considering and separating the training package separate from the practice, because the practice package needs to think differently, and perhaps the basic competencies should not be split in 3 columns. It should be one agreed minimum competencies that we see across the board, and then see how things and where things are. Because I think it's a really complex world, and you're trying to do too much too quickly with a pace that's not digestible.
Thank you, Faisal. Fiona, hang on. I'll let you come in a moment. One thing I just wanted to do was bring it back to the philosophical question. One thing that was brought up in our in one of our previous debates was that the word empathy doesn't appear in this document. Please correct me if I'm wrong in any of the framework competences. And I guess we're speaking as a humanistic integrative practitioner who focuses very much on the relationship. Given the therapeutic relationship is often cited as one of the key factors in successful therapy, I don't know, do the panel think that this has been mentioned enough, touched upon enough?
Personally, I feel, I mean, not quite as strongly as Ian, that SCoPEd is psychoanalytically sort of imbalanced, but I don't feel it offers an equal representation of the different values that we have in therapy. So, you know, like you, Caz, empathy and congruence, encounter groups, personal development, things like that are very important to my practice, and they're not acknowledged, even let alone addressed within the framework from what I've seen.
Okay, thank
Fiona,
you.
Yeah, I was just going to say one of the challenges of a high level, by which I mean, you know, written at a very general level, is that those kinds of conceptualizations of the therapeutic relationship aren't dealt with in that kind of detail. What you do have is you have a whole theme on relationship, and you have criteria which talk about a model of the therapeutic relationship. That's where all that would sit. So I'm not apologizing for the fact that the word empathy doesn't appear, but I'm saying that level of detail. I mean, one little known fact is that the first aspiration of the SCoPE project before I joined it was that it would cover every single modality as a separate framework. Now, I can't even begin to imagine what that would look like. But the point is, it's an attempt to be pan-theoretical, and it's an attempt to be at a level where every person is free to go and flesh that out in exactly their own language and their own approach, which honors those different traditions and those different ways of understanding human distress and how we work with that. That's why, you know, if it's come across as very psychoanalytic, then there's possibly more work to do, because we've already tried to address that. We did that in the second iteration over the first. If we're not there yet, I know we've got feelers out with the person-centered community to have more conversations with them. We are open to that, but I still think that if we do nothing, we're missing an opportunity to work together and to achieve something which actually could have an impact. And by that, I mean for the right reasons, not for the power reasons or for the self-interested, but in order to be seen as the place to go to employ people to work with people who are distressed. And somehow or other we're not succeeding in that, even in this moment in time. And we ought to ask ourselves why that is.
Can I just ask you about that?
Hang on, Ashleigh. Ashleigh, there's not going to be any time to come back on that. We've only got a few minutes left, and this last question, it's just going to require a yes or no answer from the membership bodies. Okay. So there's been quite a lot of conversation about this. Will the membership bodies present be giving their members a democratic vote on whether the final iteration of SCoPEd will be taken up?
Well, just quickly, we've already stated that quite clearly to our members that that's all we're doing. That's what we do with everything.
Okay, so a yes from the NCS.
From NCS.
Yes, and it's all been discussed at our council where people have representatives, and that isn't our model. So no, yes and no.
So yes, in the effect that people elect your executive, but no to the members. Yeah, Fiona.
I would want to say, I'm afraid, that it depends what you mean by democratic. It's a very difficult to achieve a democratic outcome, as we've discovered in many things we put out to the whole membership. We don't get a sufficient response rate for it to be representative of the whole organisation, and that's a big challenge. So my answer to that is, if it is, how we achieve that democratic vote is a puzzle I haven't yet solved.
Okay, so there's a question for you about actually what a vote is,
we certainly want to bring our members with us.
All of us do that.
And the recent questionnaire shows that the support for the aims and the understanding of the aims is very high. The support for the current iteration is more mixed, and that's an interesting finding. Even though it was only 14% of people who replied, despite many reminders, that is still a representative of our membership categories and of a range of views. It is not, obviously, the whole membership.
It comes to 4.34% are in favour. 4.34% are in favour.
It's a lot fewer who are against, though. And let's not go down that route. It's not helpful at this point. We're doing these things because we think this does carry confidence.
Carry on doing this until you have a framework that you're going to put to the members. And it seems at the moment that you're not taking note of what people are saying about
we are taking note. We are taking note, and we also analyse who's conversing where and in what sorts of numbers. But the issue of implementation actually sits now with the expanded oversight committee, which met for the first time last week. So I think those questions have yet to be determined.
Okay.
As we got a couple of minutes, I'd like to hear if Ashleigh wanted to say something, if that's okay.
Yeah. Is that okay? Yeah, I will be quick. I just wanted to say that I feel like whether it's bias for being psychoanalytical, I think it's impossible for you to argue otherwise based on the fact that particular schools like TA, like psychoanalytical trainings, don't have trainings that are level 4 and 5. And there's philosophical differences around why that is as well. So the framework is naturally biased to put higher competencies on higher trainings because their trainings only start from level 6 and level 7. And I feel like that's not addressed. That's kind of the point, and because there's no, I accept that you have gone out as organizations, asked all the training organizations what they do, and you have mapped that. But what you haven't shown me is any evidence that you have to do what those training organizations say to be an effective, competent and good therapist, and that the evidence is there to support that. That was it. That was my shortest, succinct way of.
Given we're in the last moments, and we did agree to end at past. I just want to say how much I've welcomed the opportunity to have what has felt like a good discussion, and that's actually not an easy thing to achieve over SCoPEd because of the strength of feelings around it. So just I wanted to acknowledge that and hope that people will find some sort of responses to the things that they care about.
Yeah, I agree.
I really appreciate that, because I think it has been difficult to get everybody around the table. And I hope everybody, I know we've not covered absolutely everything that we wanted to, but I hope everyone has been able to kind of express their viewpoint as best that they can. And I think it has been a good debate and a good discussion, and lots of good points that have been made in that. Caz, do you want to have the final word?
I will, yes. Yeah, so I mean, absolutely echoing Fiona, echoing Peter, you know, it's just been great to have everyone here. And yeah, it has felt, like I said at the beginning, let's get stuck in. It has felt like we have actually got stuck in, and that there's, you know, really pulling out different things in different areas. And hopefully it's given not just the viewers, but everyone also here, maybe things to think about, take away and think about, just hearing everyone's views and being able to express their own. So yeah, on behalf of Peter and myself and Therapists Connect, I want to thank everyone for watching. Please do find us. We have like scrolling across the bottom with our Twitter account and Instagram and all of that. So please do hook up with us. And yeah, thank you, Peter, as well for doing this with me. I know it must have been stressful.
Off of it. I was
yeah. Could I just say, I shouldn't have said that about the chair of nice. I can't remember his name, but I shouldn't have said it. I don't know if you can snip that bit out, or if you can't, please leave it in that I regret having said that.
All right. Okay, thanks a lot for watching, everyone, and bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.